So, endorsements and product placements from influencers can be pretty helpful. If you look on the right, this chart by Media Kicks says that 17% of marketers will spend over half their marketing budget on influencer marketing. This is a big deal. We know that there are different types of influencers. You could call them macro influencers, people with 100,000 or more followers, micro influencers, somewhere between 10,000 to 100,000, and then nano influencers, people with less than 10,000 followers. What's really interesting when we think about these different types of follow or influencers, and these classifications of influencers is that there is some research actually from a couple different places that suggests that in certain instances micro influencers are more persuasive than macro influencers. So you can get smaller influencers um, to advertise your product or give your brand an endorsement, and it can be pretty influential. One reason is that with micro influencers or even nano influencers, you're able to really target a specific consumer segment, right? So if we were to look at, let's say, Kim Kardashian, I'm sure she has hundreds of thousands of followers. Kim Kardashian's followers are probably less homogenous than someone who has, 5,000 followers, and you're following them because they, make Halloween ornaments that you love. Well, if you're a company that sells Halloween gear, you know that each person there absolutely loves Halloween ornaments, right? And DIY Halloween ornaments. So if you're Party City, you might want to advertise with that nano influencer. Um, there's research that shows that nano influencers are also pretty helpful when you have a hedonic product, a product that's about pleasure. But again, it depends on what business you have and what your goals are. Should you use a macro or micro? Oh, and your budget, right? You might want to use nano or micro influencers when you have a smaller budget. So another reason to use influencer marketing is there's some research by Tap Influence that influencer marketing has the potential to gain 11 times the ROI versus traditional media. And research has shown that social media influencer generated content is estimated to be several times more effective than studio shot content. So essentially, when an influencer is just kind of streaming their life, or they're streaming a makeup tutorial or a shoe tutorial or a whatever tutorial, there's research showing that that can be more effective than a commercial that's being shot in a studio, or a television show, or these kind of things. um, I think this is interesting. What are people's primary goals when they work with these influencers? Usually they really are trying to generate more engagement. The companies are trying to, our marketers are trying to reach new audiences. They're trying to drive revenue. They're trying to strengthen their community on social media. There are a lot of different goals that marketers have when they are working with content creators. Um, Least of which is, of course, ROI, and the fact is that some social media influencer marketing is just very effective. And if you are a company, you need to figure out if that's true for your particular organization. You definitely want to analyze the feedback that you receive on social media, right? I put this on here, why consumers unfollow brands on social media. It's because they think that they have poor quality in terms of their product or their support. They have issues with privacy. You might have a scandal. Your brand doesn't post enough. Again, great feedback for a company. You don't post enough. What's the point of me following you? The company has negative press. You could have too many ads. You need to figure out why people are following you, while they're unfollowing you, why they're buying products from you, why they're buying products from your competitors. And to do that, you need to make sure you're analyzing feedback. I cannot stress the importance enough. One thing that becomes really important when you're thinking about marketing communication and maybe digital or social media marketing is that you need to understand that there are usually three models of marketing communication, right? So the first is the one to many model. And this is where the marketer creates kind of one platform, one advertisement, one sales promotion, and pushes it out to many customers, right? So one marketer, you're talking to many customers. On the other hand, you can have the one-to-one model, where it's one marketer and it feels as though the marketer is having direct conversations with each customer, right? So the one-to-one model. In this case, you can do this with database marketing, you can do this with direct marketing, you can do this with personal selling, personal selling. Um, Social media, however, really follows this kind of many to many model, meaning that customers have the ability to talk to themselves to the point where they can kind of ice out the marketer if they want to. So if you are a hip hop head or a sneaker head and you want to create your own social media channel or social media account where this is what you post, you could be more influential than Nike talking to sneaker other people who like sneakers. You absolutely could become that much more influential. If that is the case and you're Nike, what do you just twiddle your thumbs? No, you want to make sure that you're engaging with people who are working this many to many model, people who are talking to the masses, right? You want to make sure you're talking to this person who owns this account, and maybe you can get them to endorse you. Maybe they can run ads for you. Maybe they become a big part of your promotional strategy. But remember that when you're talking about social media, you're not just talking about you as an organization or you as an entrepreneur and how you are influencing your customers. Remember that your customers can also be influencing your customers. And your detractors can be influencing your customers, right? How many people are influenced when they see someone say something like, "Oh, I hate Delta. There are 98 million reasons for me to hate Delta," so on and so forth. Delta needs to be aware of these people. Just a few more slides that I want to note. Trust and utility tend to be the most important factors shaping purchase decisions online, right? Utility or usefulness of online shopping, better prices, convenience, speed, sure, great, all of that. Make sure you understand that these are reasons why people shop online. But trust becomes important because you want to make sure that people do not perceive a lot of risk in terms of doing business with you. You want to make sure that you have that people at least perceive you as being credible, that people perceive working with you as being easy. And you can do this by building strong reputations for honesty, fairness, delivery, so on and so forth. You can also co-opt this by selling your product on platforms, right? So if you are a small business owner and you make crafts or you make hair products, one way that you can kind of increase your level of credibility, tamp down, dampen consumer fears or distrust or perceptions of risk by, going through Etsy or going through PayPal. This creates a feeling, at least to the consumer, that you're more credible, that you offer fewer risk because you're being backed by these companies. But remember that trust and utility are huge when it comes to online shopping. And if you want customers to buy from you online, if you want them to listen to you online, you want to make sure that you are not doing things that kind of get in the way of that trust or that utility. I've already talked about analytics a little, but I just want to just end by saying you've got to be monitoring your social media, right? You've got to monitor your social media. There are a lot of tools out there that will allow you to monitor your social media. There are a lot of tools out there that will allow you to kind of make sure you have a huge peek under the tent, that will analyze data at every level, right? At every stage of the process. You want to be looking at awareness analytics, engagement analytics, interaction, purchase activity, loyalty, and post-purchased analytics. You want to look at all of those things, right? You want to see, oh, Cassandra purchased a purse from me. How many times since purchasing that purse has she come back to the website? Are we still engaging with Cassandra? She bought a really expensive purse, which I normally don't do, but let's say I did. You want to make sure that you're keeping Cassandra interested in your product, interested in your brand, and interested in your company. So the next time she decides to buy another expensive purse, she's buying it from you again, right? So that said, let me move on to talking about the self. All right, so let's begin talking about the self. So the first question that always comes up when we talk about the self is, does the self exist? Um, we assume that it does. There has been some literature and some theoretical frameworks that assumes that there is no self, that the self by itself is no real thing, that a collective groups of people are what help form the self, which we'll talk about a little later. So the 1980s were called the Me Decade, and if you did not know this, March 7th is designated Self Day by Self Magazine. So you missed it this year, but mark your calendars for next year so you can celebrate yourself on March 7th. So when we talk about the self, we mean the meanings attached to a person by that person and by others that are based on personal characteristics and on people's social roles and memberships in various groups. So when we think about the self, it's a product of what you are, meaning the social groups that you are a part of, what society expects you to be, which tends to be a big deal when we're talking about the self. How society expects you to act often is the backdrop or framework for how you act. And then what experiences you have, and how you deal with them. Of course, the self would not be the self without the knowledge and accumulation of social events and experiences that consumers have. So I should say, before I move on, when we talk about the self, there are many different fields and disciplines that talk about the self. Who is the self? So you could think of philosophy, psychology, sociology, and then of course marketing. So when we're talking about the self, we often refer to self-concept, the beliefs a person holds about his or her own attributes or characteristics, and how he or she evaluates these qualities. So we could think of things like the content of your self content. I'm sorry, of your self concept. So when you think of things like your attractiveness versus your mental aptitude, these are different attributes that could be considered a part of a person's self concept. So for some people, they may think that they're attractive. For some people, they may think that they're intelligent. And of course, there are some people who think that they're both of those things. We also think of the positivity of the self concept, how positive a person's self concept is, which we usually refer to as self esteem. The intensity and stability of your self concept over time. So, if you were to say, hey, I'm really intelligent, how much do you believe that? Again, the intensity, and then the stability. Do you believe that over the course of your life? One thing that tends to be true is that most people consider themselves intelligent because most parents consider their kids intelligent, right? So most parents will tell you, oh, you're so smart, blah, blah, blah. And then the question becomes, as you kind of grow up and as you are exposed to other people, How smart are you, of course, relative to them, because that's usually how we determine these things, right? We make a relative case for ourselves. We talked about that last week when we talked about or discussed social comparison. Last but not least is accuracy. So accuracy is another dimension of self-concept, the degree to which one's self-assessment corresponds to reality. And this is probably one of the issues that comes up a lot when we talk about self-concept. Most people don't know who they are, right? So they have a self-concept built on a bunch of biases, right? So they think that they're extremely smart, they think they're extremely attractive, they think they're extremely talented, all of those things. But the question is, how realistic are those things? There is a pretty famous study that I didn't put in here, but a pretty famous study where, and I think I've mentioned this before, a group of researchers asked consumers to kind of talk about or list out and provide some kind of context to their concept. So, they would say things like, or ask questions and have the consumers fill out forms. How attractive are you compared to other people? How intelligent are you compared to other people? How competitive are you? All of these things. And then rather than just kind of taking those answers, they called in that person's close friends to see if there was a correlation. So what you would see was, let's say as a scale of 1 to 10, you ask the consumer, how intelligent are you? The consumer would say, I'm well above average. I'm a 9, 8 to 10, something like this. And then you'd ask their friends who know that person, and they'll say somewhat at least somewhat more objective, right? Not necessarily objective, but somewhat more objective. And you see that those numbers decrease. How intelligent is your friend? The people would say somewhere between, let's say, a 3 and a 5, right? How attractive are you? The person would say, oh, I'm a 7. And their friends would rate them more, again, between a 3 and a 6, let's say. And so we tend to be pretty inaccurate when it comes to describing ourselves. I'll give you an example related to me. If you were to ask me how competitive I am, I would tell you that I'm not very competitive. But if I say that to any person who really knows me, they will not buy this. Because apparently it turned out that I'm really not that competitive until I start competing, right? So in general, I'm not really a competitive person. I was raised in a house where my mom always said you just compete with yourself. But the minute I enter a competition, apparently I become more competitive, which is just funny to me because, again, I wasn't really raised to be competitive. If you ask me, I would say I'm not that competitive, but I guess I really am. So one question that comes up when we're talking about self-concept is how self-concept develops. And so I'm going to take the time to go over a few slides that discuss this very thing. So the first idea is that we have these reflected appraisals. They call this the looking glass self after Cooley, the guy who actually invented this idea or came up with this idea and came up with this term as well. According to Cooley, each of us develops a self-concept that matches the way we believe others see us. So as you can see in the picture on the right, this woman sees herself reflected in these mirrors, which are just the minds of other people, right? So one person sees her as somewhat nerdy, another person sees her as an angel, another person sees her as the devil, and someone else sees her as a little girl. So the way this would work is that we imagine how we appear to other people. We interpret other people's reactions, so how we believe that they're evaluating us, and we develop a self-concept based on that. So, according to how we imagine others have judged us. Of course, the most significant people that we're considering when we're developing our self-concept are our significant others and people whose opinions that we especially value. And by significant others, it could be your partner, your lover, it could be your mom, your father, your siblings, so on and so forth. Just the people in your life who are the most important to you. Another theory of self-concept development suggests that self-concept develops based on social comparisons. So we evaluate ourselves in terms of how we compare to others. And in this sense, reference groups would be really important, right? So we compare ourselves against reference groups, and that influences both our self-esteem, how we feel about ourselves, and then our self-concept. So in this, I'll go back to the picture on the right. So in this picture on the right, you see two women. They're comparing themselves to each other. One has brunette hair, the other has blonde hair. One has short hair, the other has longer hair. One has an apple on her head, the other has an orange. So those social comparisons kind of abound here. But again, this is one idea of how we develop our self-concept. Another theory regarding how we develop our self-concept is called social identity theory. This was developed by Tajfel and Turner. I should say, before I kind of discuss the theory, that this is a very robust theory. I talked about it on the first day of class about how when it comes to overweight consumers, if you have friends who are overweight, you are likely to also be overweight. But there have been so many different studies carried out using social identity theory that have proven themselves to be true, right? They've been able to use social identity theory (SIT) to investigate and document a number of phenomena. So again, a very robust theory. So according to SIT, or social identity theory, our self-concept comes from the social groups we identify with, and specifically the social groups we identify strongly with. We consider those groups to be our in-group, and a researcher would also consider those groups to be an in-group. What's really important about the in-group is that we tend to be biased towards the positive characteristics of that group, such as status or power. And we also consequently tend to be biased negatively biased, I should say, towards the out group, people who are not us. And so we often associate them with undesirable characteristics. This would also be one of the theories that explains why people can be in maybe horrible groups and still consider those groups to be fairly positive. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. I'll reference the picture on the right. According to social identity theory, us, whoever us may be, is seen in this really positive light. In this case, is an angel, and the out group, or them, is considered or seen in a very negative light. And in this case, it's a picture of a guy who looks like the devil, right? But what's really interesting, if you pay close attention to the pictures, is that both guys are the same guy. Right? So even though your group and the other group might be very, very similar, you'll still kind of create this artificial boundary between them. And we do that because according to social identity theory, we'd like to keep positive self-esteem about ourselves. So that's one benefit of this us and them categorization. We really want to see ourselves in a positive light, and so we see members of our in-group, or us as social identity we would call them, as positive, right? Because that helps us maintain positive self-esteem. So I'm going to give you a chance to take a 2-minute think break. And in this think break, I want you to think about stereotypes. So stereotypes of other people, stereotypes of yourself, stereotypes that you know about. Thanks. So now I want to talk about stereotype threat. Which is a theory that, again, is really robust. It's been shown to be a factor in a lot of phenomena. So let me talk about it. So stereotype threat is a situational, it depends on the situation, let me stress that, predicament in which individuals are at risk of confirming negative stereotypes about their group. It is the resulting sense that one might be judged in terms of negative stereotypes about one's group, instead of on personal merit. This added stress can end up impacting how the person actually performs in a particular situation. And so the way stereotype threat works is that a person has both the ability to diagnose the situation, meaning that they understand that this uh, let me say this. Let me start off by saying a person is aware of a stereotype about them, right? They also have the ability to diagnose the situation and say, in this particular situation, I am at risk of confirming a stereotype. That's what's going on in the box in the left. What then happens, right, when both of those things are taken together, is that the person feels some type of self-threat, right? So they feel threatened, right? At the end of the day, whatever I do, I'm just going to confirm that stereotype. People are going to judge me based on this stereotype. No one is considering who I am as a person or my own personal merit. And based on kind of that self-threat, according to Steele and Aronson, as well as I should say Steele and then later Steele and Aronson, as well as other researchers who've looked into this phenomena, a variety of things can happen. The person starts feeling distracted, they lose motivation, they might have some level of test anxiety or general anxiety, they become apprehensive of kind of this evaluation, they might become more self-conscious than normal, so on and so forth. Lots of different theories of what happens then. Regardless of which one of these things is true, and again, these aren't mutually exclusive, a person can feel a loss of motivation and an increase in self-consciousness. Regardless of what happens, what then happens, the last arrow you see, is that you see this interference with performance. And so I'm going to go over some slides next that shows what that looks like. So again, you have under stereotype threat, you have this risk of confirming a negative stereotype about your group. And Steele and Aronson, I mentioned Aronson in the last slide, found that situational factors, significantly more than individual personality or other characteristics, can strengthen or weaken stereotype threat. And so what does that look like? So they've done these tests on minorities, they've done these tests on women and white men. They often look at minorities and women in terms of test taking ability, right? So there is this belief that minorities will do poorly on test, and what they find, actually I'll talk about it in the next slide. And they've also looked at white men and their athletic ability. I'll talk about this one because I don't talk about it on the next slide. So what they find, and this is kind of an interesting example, is if they take white men and they put them, let's say, on a golf course. They've used golf course, or they've also done basketball arena, whatever you want to do. Or court, whatever you want to do. And they remind the white men that they're white men, right? So they have them kind of go around a room and state their ethnicity, or they have them where they kind of say, hey, here are the white guys, and then they have another group and they go, here are the non-white guys, right? Here are the men of color or whatever. What they find is that being reminded that they're white negatively impacts the ability of white men to do well in an athletic situation. So on the golf course, they remind white men that they're white. White men play golf, play kind of golf poorly. Similarly, they remind white men that they're white, and white men underperform on a basketball court, right? So I'll talk about a few other studies now that I've kind of discussed the white guy. So they've also done this with gender and race, as I mentioned in the last slide, and we can see this huge difference. So they looked, let me look at the left graph first. So when told that a difficult math exam showed gender differences favoring men, this is the situation that happened on the left. Women performed worse than their male counterparts. And if you look at this difference, it's quite big, right? So the gender difference between men and women, when women were told prior to taking the exam that the exam itself favored men, right? Women performed significantly worse. However, if you put those women, you put women and men in a situation and you don't mention gender at all, right? So you don't do anything to highlight the women's gender and you do everything you can to keep the test neutral. You see almost no gender differences in results. On the graph to the right, you see a very similar pattern when it comes to African Americans. So on the left side of this graph, um, of the blue graph, I should say, excuse me, people were asked to indicate their race prior to completing the exam. And as you see, when you're asked to complete your race prior to completing the exam, Black participants did extremely poorly compared to white participants. However, that gap lessened quite a bit when you took away the prime, right? And so I'll move to the next slide before I kind of talk about what I think some of this means. So you can see whether it's the example with the white men, whether it's the example with the women, or the example with people of color, that being reminded of a stereotype against you, or put in a situation where you have the opportunity to confirm a stereotype, can be quite problematic, and it can create, a drop in performance, and in a lot of cases a significant drop in performance. But in addition to this drop in performance, stereotype threat has some other consequences that are also negative. Research has shown that it reduces learning and persistence. People will give up because they think that it's not worth it. They're going to always confirm this stereotype. It reduces feelings of belonging in consumers. It also has some subtle negative effects, right? So people who are at risk of confirming stereotypes can be reluctant to take leadership roles, right? Because they don't want to confirm stereotypes when in a leadership role. It discounts performance, right? We talked about this. It decreases, or oh, I'm sorry, wrong thing. It discounts performance, meaning that people will then say, it doesn't really matter how I do on this test, for example. I'm still gonna, I'm still going to confirm stereotypes. It also leads students not to speak up in class. So things to consider. Research has shown that there are ways to minimize stereotype threat. One way to minimize stereotype threat is to provide information about stereotype threat. So people who know about stereotype threat are less likely to be affected by these stereotype threat primes, right? Or situational issues, or situations, I guess I should say. You can reframe the task as opposed to saying, hey, this task is going to be related to your ethnicity or your gender or whatever it is. You can reframe that and say, this is a task that has nothing to do with a person's gender, or blah, blah, blah. You can de-emphasize the threatened social identities. So one thing that you could do is, rather than kind of looking at people and saying, oh, you're this ethnicity, or oh, you're this gender, you could talk about something else, like, oh, you like Star Trek, right? Or, oh, how many people like Star Trek? These are our Trekkies and these are our non-Trekkies, as opposed to these are our people of color and non-people of color. These are our women and these are our men. You can also do more to encourage self-affirmation, making people feel good about themselves and boosting self-esteem can really help with stereotype threat. You can emphasize high standards with assurances about capability for meeting those high standards, right? You can tell people, this test is hard, but I know you can do it. And then last but not least, you can provide consumers with role models. One reason that as marketers we would be concerned with stereotype threat, we know that we have some marketers like myself who are interested in social marketing, right? But two, we also know that there are many instances where people will feel as though they have the opportunity to confirm a stereotype, and that might influence whether or not they decide to do things like shop in your store, or spend money at your company, or even kind of go to your store, or these kind of things. So it's always really important to kind of think about these psychological issues and or situations, or kind of psychological matters, and how they affect consumers. There was a research paper not too long ago in the Journal of Consumer Research where they looked at stereotype threat in eating behaviors, and they found that overweight people are significantly more likely to eat more when they're in these stereotype confirming situations, for example. So going back to self-concept, one thing to remember about self-concept is that it is subjective. It can be unrealistically favorable or unrealistically harsh of feeling negative, right? Sonia Parker says it's easy to sit around and judge other people. The hard part is looking in the mirror and judging yourself. That tends to be true. A lot of people cannot judge themselves in any kind of objective fashion. And this is why I would argue people get very shocked when things don't go their way, right? So I'm smart, and then they fail the test, right? Or I'm attractive, and then they can't get a date. These kind of things. We are not good judges of ourselves. Why? Research suggests that there are 4 reasons why. 1, we use obsolete info. We look at past success or past failures to kind of help us figure out current situations, right? So I'll give you an example that's not funny, but I think it's kind of funny. Anytime I tell a student, hey, I think you need to practice your writing, or you need to kind of think about, your writing, or try harder, I always get the student, never fails. The student will say, I'm a good writer. And then they'll say something like, when I was in middle school, I won an essay contest. That's fine. But that's just not really relevant for kind of what's going on in this class several years later. We could also use distorted info, right? So at one point in time, let me not even use that as an example. We can use distorted info, right? So we might have feelings that we're super attractive, right? Like we're really attractive. We look in the mirror and we're constantly getting compliments about ourselves, or giving ourselves giving ourselves compliments, so on and so forth. But again, we're unrealistically favorable sometimes, and so that could be a little distorted. Sorry. The myth of perfection. So sometimes we're harsh because we believe that we can attain perfection, right? So maybe you have really great skin, right? Super great skin. People give you compliments all the time, and yet you look in the mirror and you hate your skin. You think that for some reason it can get better, and yet your skin is better than 99% of the population, right? Or maybe you're a really good baseball player, and the only thing you can think about is all of your fails, as opposed to the fact that you're better than 90% of the team. And then last but not least, we're not good judges of ourselves because of social expectations. We're not judging ourselves based on reality. We're judging ourselves based on what society says we should be, right? So if society says you should, be a woman who is 5'2" and weighs, 88 pounds, and that's not you, you're going to judge yourself harshly. At the same time, if society says that as a man, you should know how to fix your own car and, be handy around the house, you might judge yourself a little bit more harshly if you can't do those things. Just like our personalities can resist change, self-concept resist change. We have what is known as cognitive conservatism, a tendency to cling to an existing self-concept even when evidence shows that it is obsolete. So even when there's evidence showing that you have changed as a person, in a lot of cases we'll cling to this old self-concept that we have. You can, however, change your self-concept, right? Just like your personality changes over time, you can change your self-concept. To do so, 4 things are needed. One, realistic expectation. So we talked a few slides ago about how unrealistic we can be in our expectations, and our perception of self, which is the second thing that's needed, right? We can be really unrealistic in how we perceive ourselves to be. The third thing you need, of course, is the will to change, and the last thing you need is the skill to change. And I would argue that all of these things are difficult, right? This is why self-concept resists change. The will to change who you are can be rough. The skill to change who you are, I would argue, is even tougher. Um, because I would argue that a lot of us, for whatever reason, aren't really equipped with the skills to change who we are, because we don't really have a lot of people who show us how to do that. And we haven't seen that kind of modeled a lot. So, anyway, my own 2 cents. So, when we talk about the self, one thing that we have to acknowledge is kind of how we think about the self. And it turns out both Western and Eastern cultures believe the self is divided, right? So, you have an inner or more private self, you have an outer or more public self. In Western cultures, there tends to be a strong emphasis on individualism, or these expressions of independent, self-contained selves. So you are self-contained, you are independent, so on and so forth. Whereas in Eastern cultures, they tend to really reflect collectivism, and expressions of interdependent and interconnected self, right? So I am one of a group as opposed to I am Cassandra. So when we talk about self-concept, we often talk about very specific things in conjunction, just kind of with the whole idea of self-concept. We talk about self-esteem, which, as I said earlier, the positivity of a person's self-concept. We talk about real and ideal or actual selves. Your ideal self is how you would like to be, right? So I'd like to be rich. I'd like to be 6 foot tall or 5 foot tall, or whatever. Actual, a realistic appraisal of who we really are. So who would you like to be versus who you really are? And then how do you bridge the gap between selves? So oftentimes retailers and other kind of entities make an attempt to um, target consumers for their fantasy appeals, because fantasy often helps us bridge that gap between who we are versus who we'd like to be, right? And so that's where a lot of advertising dollars are spent when you talk about the self.